This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton, with your devotion taken from the book of Joshua, chapter 9. We find that in the book of Joshua, chapter 9, the destruction of the city Ai is complete, and now the nation of Israel was turning their attention toward the rest of the region. When we get into chapter 9, we find that there were 6 kings that had decided that instead of being picked off one by one like what happened to Jericho and Ai, that they would form a pack and that they would come together as one in order to fight against the nation of Israel. In the middle of all that, there's a town called Gibeon, which was somewhere between 8 and 10 miles away from Ai. And the leaders of that town had decided that instead of being destroyed by the nation of Israel, that they would create a ruse where they would go to the nation of Israel and pretend to be from a country far away. And so they went through all the process of loading down the donkeys with old wineskins, with old clothes, and they had old sandals on. They even put bread in their backpacks or in their saddles that showed that it was moldy and old and dried out. And when they came to the nation of Israel and to Joshua, they said, "We are from a country far away, and we have heard of what your God has done for you, how you have destroyed the city of Jericho and how you destroyed the city of Ai." In fact, they had even expressed how that they had heard that the God of Israel had divided the Red Sea in order to allow the Israelites to cross over it and to destroy Egypt. And so we find that the reputation of Israel was spreading across the land and continuing to put fear in the hearts of the inhabitants, to the point that the leaders of Gibeon decided to come to Israel under a false pretense and to pretend that they were from a country far away in order to make a peace treaty with Israel, for they had said that it would be better to serve the Israelites than it was to be destroyed by the Israelites. The one thing we need to remember is that Satan is behind all deception. And that's what they did to the nation of Israel, and that's what they did to Joshua. Now, that doesn't let Joshua and the nation of Israel off the hook, because as we will find as the scriptures go on, they had an opportunity to correct it. But in reality, what happened in verse 7 was they trusted in their own instinct. In fact, they had a warning signal that kind of caused them to think twice about what was going on, but instead of following that inclination that they had in verse 7, they leaned unto their own understanding in verse 14. Verse 7 says, "Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, 'But perhaps you live near us. How then can we make a treaty with you?'" They knew that something was up. They had a gut intuition, if you would, but instead of pausing and seeking the Lord's will, they made a decision on their own. In fact, when you read verse 14, it says, "The men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord." They went on face value. They went on their own human wisdom instead of following the Lord spiritually. The Bible addresses this, and it says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." Proverbs chapter 3, 5 through 6. If the nation of Israel had not leaned on their own understanding, they would not have found themselves in a position of making a treaty with the inhabitants of Gibeon, one that would come back to bite them later, because whenever it was that they realized that they had been deceived, they had given their oath, they had given their promise under the name of the Lord to the inhabitants of Gibeon, and they could not destroy them because they had made that peace treaty with them. But that didn't mean that they couldn't put them in bondage and make them carry their water and split their wood and provide to the provisions of the fighting men of Israel, which is what they did. However, there's one point that we want to realize. When you don't consult the Lord, 3 things can come as a result of it at least. Number 1, you give away your spiritual advantage. That's what the nation of Israel did. Instead of going and conquering Gibeon, now they had to live with them the rest of their life as they would serve them, but yet it would be a burden unto them. The second thing is that you create unnecessary grumbling. Whenever it was that the fighting men found out what the leaders of Israel had done in making the treaty, they were unhappy with it, because their intent was to go in and do like the Lord had said, and that was to destroy everybody that stood in their path so that they could take the promised land. Now, one of the things that we'll realize later is because of the way in which the inhabitants of Gibeon had done to the nation of Israel, everyone else in their path paid the price for it, and we'll see that as we go on. The third thing is that will happen when you don't consult the Lord is you'll commit to obligations that you wish you didn't make. And that's what happened with the nation of Israel, is they'd made that obligation and later they regretted it. And the question is, why? Because they did not consult the Lord. We would serve ourselves well if in every decision, before we are led by the author of deception, that we would consult the Lord and ask God's input into a matter so as not to make a mistake that we would live with the regrets of later. Joshua made a miscalculation. It's addressed in the book of Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 7 in principle. It says, do not be wise in your own eyes. If we don't want to live a life of regrets, if we don't want to live with a burden around us because we made an unnecessary or hasty commitment before we consulted the Lord, then we need to be wise in the eyes of the Lord and not wise in our own eyes.